Welcome to this evening's program on the racial and economic underpinnings and impact of mass incarceration. We're so thankful that you were able to join us, and we would like to acknowledge Dean Aviva Abramovsky, who is also in attendance tonight. Many thanks to the UB Law Alumni Association's Committee on Social Justice and Racial Equity, as well as UB School of Law for organizing this evening's event. I'm the current president of the UB Law Alumni Association and Joint. We would also like to thank and acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Bar Association of Erie County, the Minority Bar Association of Western New York, and the Western New York chapter of the Women's Bar Association. It is my honor to introduce Associate Professor Alexandra Harrington, Director of the Criminal Justice Advocacy Clinic in the Law School, who will serve as tonight's moderator. Alexandra Harrington graduated in 2014 from Yale Law School and joined the UB School of Law faculty in the fall of 2020. Where she directs the law school's new Criminal Justice Advocacy Clinic. Before coming to Buffalo, she was a public interest law fellow at Yale, where she supervised students working on projects including reports that provide nationwide data on the use of solitary confinement in US prisons, and preparation of testimony and recommendations for a briefing on women in prisons before the US Commission on Civil Rights, among other undertakings. As a deputy assistant public defender in Connecticut's Innocence Project, post-conviction unit, Professor Harrington helped to shape and coordinate the division's representation of individuals who were sentenced as juveniles in adult court to lengthy prison terms. She oversaw the division's implementation of newly created juvenile parole hearings, represented clients in habeas corpus proceedings, motions to correct an illegal sentence, and state appeals. And she obtained early parole release for clients who served decades in prison for crimes committed as teenagers. Professor Harrington.
Thanks very much, Anne, for the introduction, and I'll echo Anne's thanks to everyone for being here, to the law school, and for all of our co-sponsors on this event. Before I introduce Professor Eason and turn it over for his presentation, I just wanted to note that we're going to have a presentation by Professor Eason followed by question and answer. So if I could ask that you save any questions for the end. And if you would chat to me, so you can use the chat feature in Zoom and send me a message directly to let me know that you have a question. I'll be keeping the queue so we can make sure everyone has a chance to ask. If you do happen to have a clarifying question during the presentation, please do feel free to send that to me in the chat as well, and I'll flag that for Professor Eason. But now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor John Eason. Professor Eason is a member of UB Center for Diversity Innovation's inaugural Distinguished Visiting Scholar cohort. It's a mouthful. He's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the director of its Justice Lab, which focuses on ending racial, economic, and health disparities across the rural-urban interface. Professor Eason holds a PhD from the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago, a BA in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and a Master's of Public Policy from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Before entering graduate school, Professor Eason was a church-based community organizer focusing on housing and criminal justice issues. He also served as a political organizer for then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama. His research interest challenges existing models and develops new theories of community, health, race, punishment, and rural-urban processes in several ways. By tracing the emergence of the rural ghetto, he establishes a new conceptual model of rural neighborhoods. And these relationships are explored in his book, which I believe he'll be talking a little bit about today, Big House on the Prairie, Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation, which is at the University of Chicago Press. So with that, I'm delighted to hear from Professor Eason and to turn it over to him.
I want to thank you all for that warm introduction and welcome. I want to acknowledge both Eileen and Ali for the invitation and thank the co-sponsors, the co-host as well. I'm hoping that this goes off without a hitch, but you know how Zoom has been. I'm praying that this goes right. We had some issues going back and forth between screens, so I'm hoping that I can do this right. And I think I'm off to a bad start already. I'm hoping I can get this done correctly. You're gonna have to tell me, Ali, if I get it done correctly here in 3, 2. Can you see only my title screen, or are you looking at my notes too?
No, you've got it. I think you're in the
I've
presentation.
got it. Okay, thank you. Oh, this took us all of 15 minutes before the start of the before the opening. So I'm happy I've made it to the title slide. So thank you all for having me. And it's an honor and indeed a pleasure to be here. I hope some of my cohort members from the diversity scholars are here as well. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention and acknowledge the Law Association and other legal community sponsors, the Women's Bar Association, the Minority Bar Association, and the Bar Association of Erie County. I planned on speaking to you more about so my opening is going to deal with where I'm writing right now for my second book, but the majority, about 90% of what I've decided to do after talking with the host is it's going to focus backwards on work I've already done, not just my book, but work around it. So you can see the questions I'm dealing with now, because if I just tell you what I'm doing right now, it won't make a whole lot of sense given what we think we know about why we built so many prisons. So In Our Backyard is not only the title of my talk, it's the current book project I'm working on. It reframes the pleas in my backyard or PIMB debate, PIMB debate I pose in my first book, Big House on the Prairie, by offering new theories of prison building using data on all US Census places to investigate the causes of prison building and the multiple and often conflicting ways that prisons impact the political economy of local towns, counties, and states. By expanding the scope and scale of prison building, this inquiry can serve to redefine one of the most pressing social problems of our time. Prison proliferation, the widespread expansion of prisons. In Our Backyard ties the legacy of slavery and racial violence of Jim Crow to modern political economy of underdevelopment in the rural South. While the power of past systems of racial domination and violence are salient, they cannot explain why the US tripled prison facilities. I instead offered the rural ghetto, born out of the historical legacy of racial violence, and this is the modern incarnation of oppression in the rural South. In Our Backyard will demonstrate how the rise of the rural ghetto, poverty, residential segregation, and stigma provide a powerful impetus for local prison building across the US. And despite the growing significance of prison reform, occasionally appearing in national debates, and it was in the background and sometimes in the foreground of this current presidential campaign, the potential for reform has seemed insurmountable. Given the scale of incarceration, and we have more than 2 million people locked up still to this day, even though we have a huge drop this year that the Bureau of Prisons reported in terms of jails over the summer because of COVID. Given the extensive and entrenched system of monetary sanctions, mass supervision, or the supervised society, as my colleague Ruben Miller has written about, and the footprint of our prison system, or what some have labeled carceral capacity, the resources dedicated to detecting, apprehending, processing, and punishing people deemed criminal. This is Heather Schoenfeld. But I stumbled across a keen insight a couple of years ago as I was reviewing my book and rewriting it for a small form piece in Dissent that appeared last year. And it's a keen insight provided by a key informant, John Alderson. He argued that if we could cite a high-tech, non-polluting facility that pays $100,000 a year instead of a prison, we would have, Heck, I've got the land. I'd sell it to them, but those facilities were not exactly lining up to come into places like Forest City. So my presentation today is a compilation of academic and public pieces that recap the core of my research agenda with an eye towards the new book in our backyard. I'll highlight some quantitative analysis and talk about some op-eds that I've done to set up the key questions and tell you a couple of major findings from the new book. But I begin the presentation by revisiting this piece entitled Prison in a Rural Ghetto, appearing in the fall 2019 issue of Dissent. This piece serves as a bridge between the first book and second. So prison construction requires more than concrete and stone. Given the history of racial and economic exploitation of this peculiar institution, some are convinced that blood and bodies form the bedrock, making prisons the ultimate form of racial and economic exploitation in the US. Many are certain prison building is a corrupt political process rife with blood money from privatization. This view is supported in part by the exponential increase in US corrections spending over the past 5 decades. The standard story explaining prison proliferation is that private companies hold perverse incentives to increase mass incarceration for profit. Part of what clouds our view of prison building is the farm at Angola. This is the former slave plantation that is now operated as a prison. This is a state-owned facility. It's state-owned and operated by Louisiana, and it's used to symbolize what is wrong with private prisons. Again, state-owned and operated. And we use the imagery from this institution to talk about privatization in private prisons. And I can't exactly blame folks for doing this. This is a Time magazine piece from 1977 about Angola, right? The true history of America's private prison industry. This is a more modern 2016, very similar pictures, right? You get all of the imagery of slavery. You got a dude on a horse. So it looks like, if it looks this way, it makes sense that we think about it being privatized, being slavery. I addressed the issues of private prisons versus privatization in an article in The Conversation, also picked up by Salon.com and other outlets. LB Eisen she's at CUNY, and she's at CUNY. She runs the Brennan Center at CUNY. She wrote a whole entire book on privatization versus private prisons, and she lays out the discursive connections for the use of advocacy or developing macro theories, but it provides very little empirical proof for the most vital and durable theories, and also sound policy. So as a critical step towards decarceration, we need to investigate the political economy of places that relate to building public and private prisons. And the same profit motives driving privatization is also believed to be the impetus behind the prison boom, the tripling of US facilities since 1970. So we have this perception, and we think that given this proliferation during the purported post-racial era, there's consensus that the modern prison is interchangeable with other forms of oppression like slavery, Jim Crow, and convict leasing. And Brian Stevenson, pictured here, a modern day civil rights leader and inspiration behind the blockbuster film Just Mercy, claims that slavery didn't end, it just evolves. Stevenson has personally overturned 135 wrongful convictions, freeing scores of innocent poor and people of color from the clutches of death row. Given his accomplishment, his claim of slavery not ending cannot be taken lightly, let alone dismissed out of hand. While I agree with the sentiment and tone of his righteous anger expressed in this claim, in many ways, this type of thinking denies the victorious social movements of Black folks against past racial systems like slavery and Jim Crow. Victories that can be used as examples of of how high levels of coordination, of collective action, and the fortitude needed to muster the perseverance to end the carceral state. That's mass incarceration in all its modern forms. And so not just the number of people we incarcerate, but the 8+ million people under supervision, the way monetary sanctions influence incarceration, and even how much we built prisons. As a community and political organizer for then State Senator, for Illinois State Senator Barack Obama, I also held the view that prison building was a corrupt political process rife with blood money from privatization. However, as I relocated my family to rural Arkansas, that's my wife and 2 small children, we uncovered why rural communities were increasingly demanding prisons. I would be disavowed of this notion quickly. This view of prison building is rooted in an urban northern bias, rendering rural places powerless, especially communities of color. Prison building is a complex process, complicating much of what we understand about the political, social, and economic life of rural communities. I came to learn this soon after meeting folks like Coach Cecil Twilley, pictured here, the late, great Coach Cecil Twilley, a proud man who always had a glimmer in his eyes if he knew something you didn't and was itching to tell you, but only if you asked very nicely. Coach was a pioneer in Forest City, Arkansas, and the Mississippi Delta. He integrated the local school board and administration. He was the first Black member of the local country club, the first Black head football coach after desegregation of the public schools, and the last high school football coach to win the Arkansas State Championship nearly 50 years ago. This feat was why he was still affectionately known as Coach in the predominantly Black town of more than 14,000. Forest City is also home to about 1,900 prisoners located in the Forest City Federal Correctional Facility. It was constructed in 1997. Contrary to popular belief, my empirical analysis demonstrates that the papers listed here from 2010 that towns with higher poverty rates, Black and Latinx populations are more likely to build a prison. So I'll let you think about that for a second. As you increase the percent Black and Latino and Latinx in a town, the probability of getting a prison increases. So why is that, you may ask? As an early supporter of the prison, Coach elucidates why he welcomed a hideously stigmatized institution like a prison when he explained, "I don't want my town to end up like Gary." During the 90s, Gary, Indiana became the butt of many jokes as it competed annually for the infamous title of U.S. murder capital. If you all look at the marquee there, you'll notice I saw a couple of other gray heads as I peeked into who was coming into the room. You'll notice that the Jackson 5 were playing tonight. Now, this marquee is from 2006, so that's a problem, right? If that marquee is still up in downtown Gary. This is how downtown Forest City looks in 2007. And like Gary and countless other deindustrializing American cities, Forest City faced racial stigma and uneven and underdevelopment. And recalling life before the prison, one resident noted that several plants and other major employers were closing. As he described things, when I asked him to describe things in town before the prison came, he just shook his head and said, tough, tough. Things were tough. So Coach's quip about trying to keep his town from ending up like Gary is a way to frame the prison as a means of saving the Forest City's reputation. This comparison of Forest City to Gary indicated that the town's downward trajectory was because of the rise of the rural ghetto, a neighborhood marked by the stigma of Black concentrated poverty, right? So this is where I'm going to show you a map in a minute where you see a lot of housing developments where people were segregated in Forest City. But Coach's quip also offers counterintuitive insight into why rural communities that used to respond with "not in my backyard" or NIMBY They used to say that to prisons, NIMBY, not in my backyard. They now say PIMBY, or please in my backyard. Site fights or debates over community opposition and supportive facilities with harmful environmental effects have been documented by scholars like Robert Bullard, who advocate for policies to reverse climate change. As I argue in my first book, as I argue in Big House on the Prairie, my first book, prison proliferation results from local towns covering from the stigma from the rise of the rural ghetto. And this is an essential strategy in reputation management, driving the campaign to win the placement of a prison. So I'm going to skip through some of this quickly because I want to make sure I end at 5:35. So Coach's response to demonstrate the agency of Black middlemen or Black leaders operating between the man and the little man, these folks partnered with white elites to form a growth coalition and go after the prison. One of these folks was the future mayor at that time, then city council representative and president of the local NAACP chapter, Larry Bryant. He also supported the prison. He's pictured here. The gentleman in the center of the picture is Andre Stevens. He's the executive director of the local NGO, St. Francis County Community Development Corporation. He was also a Black middleman. He supported the prison by exclaiming, "A prison beats the hell out of a paper mill." So if we're going to understand not in my backyard to please in my backyard, I can return to this later, but I want to just show you what I'm dealing with, what I'm modeling. So white elites join with Black middlemen to get a growth coalition, to get a prison. And the prison, which is stigmatized itself, is supposed to be covering for the rise of the rural ghetto. I can explain this a lot more during Q&A, but I want to show you a few more graphs just to illustrate this point about privatization as well. While many believe prison building is overwhelmingly a private venture, only 13% of all US prisons are privately owned and operated. This popular notion of privatization is understandable given the ubiquity of the prison. The United States is unique among rich countries in the world in its level of contemporary mass incarceration, a massive social change that has reshaped the nature of inequality. As a recent study shows, 6 in 10 Americans know someone in prison, 9 in 10 African Americans know someone in prison or has a family member. While this massive social problem receives attention as a major barrier to racial and economic justice in urban centers, we rarely consider that rural communities are both senders of prisoners and receivers of prisons. So this is not a constellation. This is from a paper and a project that I'm working on Arkansas. This is Black and white people returning home from prison from the Arkansas Department of Corrections. And this is where these are the communities they're clustering across. And Little Rock is in the center of the state. The rest of the state is rural. So you see that the blue dots are whites, yellow dots are Black folks. So we see that not only do we have a rural urban distribution in states like this where people are returning from home, we also see the color of incarceration, right? Prison proliferation, I'm returning to this again because rural communities simultaneously suffer from mass incarceration, the warehousing of more than 2 million people, while benefiting from the prison boom or the tripling of facilities, as nearly 70% of all prisons were built in rural communities. And despite nearly 450,000 corrections officers, 10 times the number of coal jobs, occupying a landmass of roughly 600 square miles and costing conservatively at least $30 billion to build. This massive public works project has transformed the American countryside virtually unnoticed. Many believe mass incarceration is a distinctly urban Black phenomenon. However, since 2000, rural and quite separately, white communities are sending people to prison in record numbers. So to slow the expansion of US punishment in rural communities, we need to combat the consequences of mass incarceration and rural communities' growing dependence on prison building. I'm going to skip 2 slides here. There it is. I was going to give you a whole history lesson about urban sociology, but I'll just show you this map. You see the circle, that the circle is where rich white folks lived in Forest City. That's the blue dots are white households. The red dots are Black households. So the residential segregation index is 0.86, which is hyper segregated. And those yellow dots, you'll see 6 of them on the left-hand side of your screen. Those are housing developments. So the number of Black people who live in the South End were concentrated there. There's 1,200 residents that live there, and they make up the bulk of poor people in the town. And this wasn't always so. There were poor white people there years ago, but poor white people were pushed out. Poor Black people were forced to live in the lowest parts of the land and in public housing. So they built hundreds of public housing units between 1980 and 2000. And that's why the residential segregation index increased. So a member of the white elite family who still owns, there's typically 5 to 10 families in a town like Forest City who own about 50% of the land. And these are typically white families, and they're known as the white elite. John Alderson pictured here believes that the rise in public housing can be explained quite differently. There's a whole lot of rent subsidies with apartments as well as houses. And I honestly, truthfully, don't think anybody really had a feeling for, or anybody had a handle on it. It's just one of those things that sort of happened. These people needed housing, so we built it. That's his side of the story. I think it's a little, I explain this in great detail in the book, but basically when you have concentrated poverty and residential segregation, you have stigma. And when you have a small enough town, less than 50,000, more than 10,000, it's called a micropolitan area, you can have ghettoization. And when something walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, there are urban sociologists that would like to argue with me about this, but I simply say, I'm calling this thing a duck. It's a rural ghetto. It's why we have so much inequality in rural communities. And I've given you some background on how and why it started. I'm going to spend about 2 minutes on this, giving you like some really, if you thought those results were counterintuitive, and that's like my entire research, not my entire, but the bulk of my research agenda up to this point. So if you think those results were counterintuitive, some of you, if you're good liberals, I'm glad I'm not in your presence and you don't have fruit because you'd want to throw it at me. So this is a paper I've been working on for a while with my collaborators from Texas A&M, where I was before I got to the University of Wisconsin. And so what I want to show you real quick, if I haven't mentioned a prison, at this point, I've mentioned a prison boom, but I wanted to provide a visual representation from the perspective of rural communities. So this is prison building prior to 1970, and this is rural prison building since 1970. Here are the research questions we were dealing with, and here are the findings. So this is going to be, this looks rather like non-threatening or intimidating, but I'm going to skip through a whole bunch of stuff here and get you to the end. Prison siting. So what are the state level predictors of prison building? This is, you're not going to like it. State level predictors of prison building include Democratic strength, not Republican strength. So that means Democratic legislators at the state level. If there's a Democratic governor, House, and Senate, they're more likely to build because a lot of the prison building took place in the South prior to those states going full Republican. Income inequality predicts prison building at the state level. The amount of rurality or surplus land also does. These things are important because it's believed, there's certain scholars that believe surplus land and surplus capital produce prison building. And that, I can show you that in Q&A if you'd like. That's rather inconclusive. Prison placement is local, it's town level predictors of prison building. And with this, disadvantage, poverty, unemployment, workers without a high school degree that are 25 and older. This is a disadvantage index I created. Median home value, median household income. That's a positive predictor of prison building. So is percent Black. This is a longer period. We go from 1980 to 2004, I want to say, instead of just the 90s. Population size, so the larger the rural community, the more likely it is to get a prison. And lastly, prior prison. This is all consistent with the results from my 2010 paper. And all of this points towards us needing to rethink prison building. So we need to understand the impact of prisons. Understanding the impact of prisons may require a more nuanced approach given the southern rural communities with high concentrations of Black and Latinx folks are most likely to build. It also stands to reason that if prisons did not provide some benefits and were only detrimental to rural communities, there would be less demand for this type of facility. We do not know what we do not know, however, is if prison building benefits rural low-income Blacks, whites, or Latinos because a baseline or average effect across different periods of the prison boom has not been established at the town level. That's something else I'm also working on. I'm going to go 45 seconds over, I think. So while knowledge on the prison boom is increasing, empirically driven, theoretical understandings of prison impact have yet to be established. So to be clear, I'm suggesting that mass incarceration, the annual rate of 2 million people, was not possible without the prison boom. And without the prison boom increasing from roughly 500 to 1,700 folks. I want to show you one thing before ending. I'm not even going to talk about the theory of the penal industrial complex.
Can I interrupt with a clarification question?
Yes.
We have a question. Someone asks, they thought they heard you refer to the stigma of rural race riots, but weren't sure if they heard that right. And if so,
no,
was wondering
not
if
rural race riots.
Okay.
No, didn't say that. That would be my bad if I misspoke.
Thanks.
So this is I'm gonna say one thing on this and then end on after prisons. This graph shows state prison building is a predictor of mass incarceration. This is something no one else has done. We haven't really asked what's the relationship between prison building and mass incarceration. This is a lagged, just a bivariate analysis. And what's showing here in a paper I'm working on, it's going to go into the book, is basically we built our way into the era of mass incarceration. As the cumulative number of prisons were built from 1970 forward with a 10-year lag. So we look at prison buildings starting in 1970 across each state. 10 years after, we look at the incarceration rate. Rarely do you see a line go like this, right? Just straight diagonally like that. This isn't exactly a smoking gun. We're running a lot of tests and analyses, but this is a huge contribution that will be made in a paper and in a book. And to center our debate, or not debate, to center our discussion, I want to end on this book by William Martin and Josh Price. It's about New York. It's about decarceration and what's happening here in your state. About 13 or 14 prisons have been closed since 2000. None have been built, but you have been building jails in New York, right? So you have been decarcerating, but there are some issues with how some political issues, very politicized issues about how that's happening. So I'm going to use this as a touchstone for the Q&A. So I want to thank you guys for your time and patience, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Professor Eason. And I'll remind our audience, if you have a question, if you can go ahead and just send me a message in the chat that you have a question, and I'll be keeping track of the queue. I know we have one question already on your last point about prison proliferation and mass incarceration, but before we jump in, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as the moderator to ask you a question. And I wanted to go back to what you were talking about with your earlier research. And I think, you know, I saw this throughout your papers where you talk about the stigma of prisons, that this is not an industry that people are normally, you know, clamoring, yes, we want, you know, the not in my backyard, essentially. But I think you also talked about how, and I think maybe this was Coach in particular, talks about the possibility of citing prisons in the town as an improvement, a boon to the town's reputation. And I was curious to hear a little bit more about what seems like a tension between those two things. And I wonder if it's just that the perceived, you know, employment advantages, economic advantages of having the prison there overcome the stigma, or if the stigma is not perceived in the same way in these towns, or something else entirely. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, you guys are sitting in upstate New York, right? And given, I don't know how many, if there are any folks from the city proper, and prepping for this, I talked with Ali about the urban bias, the northern urban bias. So we don't even realize how stigmatized people, the stigma is enacted every day. So people who live on Manhattan or in whatever neighborhood they live in, they'll refer to other folks as bridges and tunnel people, right? So when you get to the hinterlands like upstate or Western New York, oh my God, you guys are in a wasteland, and openly saying stuff like this. So when we get down south, and Southerners know this, Southerners know that they are looked down upon by Northerners, right? They know Northerners look down. And rural people, there's often a conflation of Southern and rurality, which I actually had to, being a native of Chicago, I had to understand, I had to come to disentangle those things myself. But when you add in, these are rural communities, and rural America we see with the last 4 years, right? People tried to blame rural America for the emergence of Trump when it's really, that was the suburbs, right? But rural America has been disenfranchised. They've been looked down upon. And then you throw in race, the stigma of race. So if you're Black and you live in a rural community in the South, they completely internalized all of those things. So if you're poor, Black, rural, Southern, you don't have a whole lot going on in your town. And in the case of Forest City, they had a history of racial violence pinned to the name. The name, the founder of Forest, the name is after Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a general in the Confederate Army responsible for one of the most heinous war crimes before he went on to found the KKK. So this town is steeped in a history of a legacy of racial violence, and they had corruption. They had urban, like, you know, city of Chicago or old time East Coast corruption scandals going on there. So the reputation of the town was spoiled. And so if the central claim of my first book is they were looking for a prison to improve their reputation, you have to understand how bad their reputation was. They had a rape, castration, arson, and a strike in 18 months in the early 80s. All of these things made national news. They were on 2020. I could detail each one, but I don't know if we have enough time. I just list them like that because a town of 14,000 having 4 horrific events. And a sheriff who was eventually arrested for running a gambling ring out the back of his office. He was running a gambling ring. So you have all of that associated with your town. You're called a dirty town. And you have to ask, what does someone's backyard look like if they want a prison to make them look better, right? So their backyard wasn't looking very good. And I don't suspect that is my case alone, right? You have most of the prisons in New York are in upstate communities. And these communities, I could see them, I think this theory can be transferred, where it may not always be Black middlemen or middle women, but it will definitely be folks who are connected to the wrong side of the tracks in whatever town they're in. So thanks for that question, Allie.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Eason. And we've got a few questions in the queue. I think our first question comes from Professor O'Rourke, and then we have Deborah, I'm so sorry, Deborah Ampsona, I think, but I may be mispronouncing your last name. Professor O'Rourke, if you're still on.
I'm sorry, I'm still here. Hi, how are you? Thank you, Professor. I really love the paper, and the end of your talk sort of clarified for me what the claim was. I was wondering if it was just a claim about the political economy of how prisons are built, or if you were offering a causal link between prison building and mass incarceration. And I understand you're making sort of the latter claim. I'm just wondering whether that complements or how it fits in with the argument that some people have made about the link between deindustrialization and mass incarceration. I'm thinking of John Clegg and Anna Usani's article in Catalyst recently that's sort of developing William Julius Wilson's argument and keeping in the prison system. And my fire alarm is on, so I'm going to mute. Thanks.
So that's a good question. So there's different links in the chain. So the end of my presentation was the second half of the claim there was the second half of the new book, but I'm looking at the causes and consequences of prison building, why we built so many prisons, where we built them, and also the impact they have on places, right? So not just local rural towns, but also counties and states. And so I think your question, you're trying to draw a direct line between deindustrialization and mass incarceration. And I actually think that process is a lot more complicated. I don't think deindustrialization causes mass incarceration as much as it underlies the conditions that that are ripe for mass incarceration. And the slide that I was actually going to go through that I skipped because I didn't want to give a whole lecture around urban sociology. But since you brought up William Julius Wilson's work, I'll tell you where sociology is today. He's emeritus, he's retired. What his students and what folks like Rob Sampson, who's no slouch himself exactly, he's out of the Chicago School of Sociology, or he taught there for a while alongside Wilson before they both went to Harvard. What we know is that neighborhoods that have suffered deindustrialization are more likely to be policed, both over-policed and aggressively policed. We also know that they're going to have more jobless folks there. Unemployment rates are going to be higher. There will be racial, high degree of racial inequality in terms of residential segregation. So all those things tie into the conditions that give rise to mass incarceration. I don't think there's one single cause or direct line between something and mass incarceration. So the last graph I showed, I'm really trying to, you can't, that's more of a common sense thing. You can't have mass incarceration if you don't have a place to put people. You have to have a place to put them. So, I showed that graph to my son, a 19-year-old who is 19-year-olds go. He's pretty smart, right? He's going to a good school and everything, but those of us who are teaching 19-year-olds, sometimes we don't like them because they say things like this. Oh, no one's done that before. No one showed that before. Yeah, that's most of sociology. It's the science of the obvious. Yeah, you need to have a place to put people. If you're going to have mass incarceration, you have to have prison proliferation. And that's all that graph is saying, right? I don't have a direct causal, given the high standards for causality now. I mean, common sense aside, right? Because you can say you're going to lock people up, but if you don't have a physical space to put them, I don't know what we're measuring there. No one's done that measurement, right? I think I'm seeing some nodding heads. These are people who have common sense that understand you can't have a phenomenon that's mass without being able to hold people, right? It's just common sense. So that's a whole other thing. Deindustrialization is no one, even prison proliferation, that's not the cause of mass incarceration. It's a huge contributor. It's not the cause. But it's a good question.
Thanks, Professor Easton. And we have a couple more questions in the queue, and everyone please do excuse my pronunciation, but we have Deborah Ansona and then Professor Sarin.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So from my understanding of what you said, it seems like we as a society have recognized this problem and moving towards progression. My question would be, how are they trying to resolve this problem within the system? So it's not enough to just say, we're not gonna arrest people or we're gonna release people for nonviolent crimes, but from your work and your study, how are in-state prison programs aiding these people that are being released so that the retention rates are lower?
So that's a good question. There are over 2,200 counties, and I want to say over 27,000 municipalities. So we think about a single criminal justice system, right? That's a part of the issue. Your specific question would have to be examined across all counties and all municipalities. And that's going to vary widely. The growth area and research to come up with policies to decarcerate is going to be, if we want to do that, it's going to be exponential because we don't have good empirical analyses. We have some great advocates like prison abolitionists and people who want to defund the police, right? So I'm all for those advocates, right, and what they're standing for. And you noted towards system change. I guess you may be hinting at possible abolition or revolution. There are 1 million police officers. There's over 900,000, over 950,000 sworn folks in this country. Now, if you think about it, I'm just going to give you the math on this, the basics of this. You have 950,000, almost 1 million police officers. You have 450,000 corrections officers. The corrections officers are disproportionately Black too, right? They're overrepresented. About a third of our corrections officers are Black or Latinx. And you want to shut down all the prisons and defund the police. And I agree with this. But the problem is the 1 million police officers we'd be putting out of work. Though the people who carry firearms in this country, on average, a gun owner owns 6 guns. Not everybody in the country owns a gun. It's just the average gun owner has 6 guns. I'd say the average cop is the average gun owner. So you want to have 1 million people who have 6 guns unarmed. I mean, armed. You want to have them armed. And another 450,000 people out of work, right? We have to decarcerate. There's too many people in prison. It was bad from the start. I'm not saying that we end policing and we shut down all prisons. We just got to start chipping away and making big breaks. We got to chip away locally by doing programming that actually reintegrates people successfully in the communities. There are examples around this, but it varies so widely from state to state. I mean, for God's sake, Portland just decriminalized all drugs, right? You can do whatever, apparently, in Portland. If you get caught with a little bit of weed in Alabama, though, you may be sent up for life. Who knows? So you have very wide policing and punishment regimes. There is no criminal justice system. It's a whole bunch of different small entities that have different cultures and different responses, and even what they consider a crime. So this is not going to be easy. I think we can do it. I don't think it's going to be done in my lifetime. If we get under 150,000, if we get under 1.5 million people in my lifetime, I would be shocked. If that will require us reducing by 600,000 people, the prison and jail population. If we do that, it can be done in the next 20 years. If we wanted to, we could get it under 1 million, but it's going to take as much effort as it took to build all of these prisons and jails and incarcerate this many people. So I don't want to I'm not trying to give you like a cop out, like it can't be done. You just need to know you're fighting unions, public unions, and you're fighting people who are well armed as well, who want their jobs.
We need some hope today, Professor Yusuf.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not that guy. I was more gloom and doom. I was like, 5 years ago, I was like, there's no way we're ever coming back from this. I'm at least now, we can chip away at it, right?
Chipping away is good. Can I turn it over? Professor Sarin has the next question, and then I see a question from Professor Bukai as well.
Thank you. Many of the New York prisons were converted from psychiatric and developmental centers for people with disabilities who were put out into the community with supposed services. But now the prison population in New York has skyrocketed with individuals with mental illness and a new phenomenon of having units of individuals with very low IQs who have to be separated from the prison population, even right here in Western New York at Wendy, which is a maximum security prison. Is this just a New York phenomenon? Have you examined that issue? And does it happen elsewhere? Thank you.
It's happened elsewhere and at different times. There's this great piece. I'm forgetting. I haven't had to pull on this piece for some time, but basically the almshouses and old folks' homes were being emptied, and we were incarcerating people in the late 1900s. There was a huge incarceration rate, a boom then, because we were emptying the poorhouses. So we've done this before, and it's not just New York. These are, like, from a strict Marxian analysis, these are unwanted people, right? These are undesirable populations. And so we use whatever state mechanisms, whatever state institutions we can to manage these people that no one wants. So part of defunding the police is coming up. It should be called refunding social services, because we cut those. The federal government and local cities cut those. So instead of being a negative in terms of defunding the police, I actually think we should make a move to have departments of health and public safety. And if you want to do something innovative in your local town, or county, you can have the police budget, freeze it where it's at. I've never seen more money. I've never seen less money going to a public institution and then do better. Freeze your police budget where it's at, but make it so that it cannot be over X% of dollars you're spending on public health. So you can keep your police budgets where they are, just spend a whole lot more on your health and human services. And so you have different first responders who can feel the need. Instead of sending people to prison, you can send them to, there are alternatives to incarceration. Where I live in Dane County, Madison, Dane County, where I got to pull up something real quick because I got to get the names of them for you. It's 3 different centers we're looking at building through it's Dane County. The Criminal Justice Council is looking to build a community, sorry about this, a community restorative court, a triage and restoration center, and a community justice center. And so these are diversions from going into jail and then into prisons, right? And these triage centers in particular can be used to assess people who are having mental health crises. So instead of police showing up and deciding whether or not they're going to shoot someone, right? You can have police who are properly trained, but you also, crisis intervention training, CIT, if you have local support for that with your sheriffs and police commanders, you could start with law enforcement, but if they're also willing to work with other public agencies that don't carry guns, who can show up and de-escalate, this can reduce the number of people you're sending into prison. And the low IQ and the other issues you were pointing out, Western and upstate New York, I imagine some of you guys have heard it as meth-induced psychosis, right? You have a lot of people who are strung out on drugs, who are having mental breaks, whose IQs may even come out, you know, they may have IQ tests that come out very low because of all the drugs they're on, right? So there are alternatives. Defunding the police is about creating alternatives to punishment. And until we learn to care about people and have empathy, and you know, the ugliness we saw during the presidential election, not to pick on any one side or the other, I hope voting is done. I think Nevada keeps taking a break. I hope we can, you know, put this whole thing to bed. But during the debate, when Biden's son, who had a drug problem, was attacked and dismissed, like the lack of empathy that we have in this country towards people who have other issues, right, that are not criminal justice issues, but we're using the criminal justice system to try and solve those issues, is a real problem. So that's going to take not just national policy change. This is stuff that you have to do locally. Voting for your judges, knowing your sheriff, holding your sheriff, all of those things are local, right? A lot of this can be taken care of locally. Dane County reduced during COVID, they reduced the jail population in 3 weeks by 40% to save lives. So it can be done if people want to do it. I hope that answers your question. I gave you like a whole bunch of, I was trying not just to answer your question, but give practical strategies for how we can address this.
Thank you.
And Professor Easton, I'm mindful of the time, so let me know if we need to cut it off. We have one more question that's actually related to the last point that you were making, related to electoral politics. So I wonder if we have time to fit in one last question before we close.
I was here until 6:30. That was on my calendar. It's on my calendar until 6:30, but if folks got to leave, they got to go.
So let me turn it over then to Professor Bucay.
Yeah, that's true. This does follow a bit on what you just said, and I feel a little bit less bad about bringing this up. But first of all, thank you for spending this time with us. You know, I guess I want to preface this by saying that my partner is from rural Pennsylvania, northwestern Pennsylvania, and ran a successful restaurant at the airport outside of Bradford for 8 years, which was just up the road, literally one mile up the road from a large federal prison. And so I feel like I just have a pretty immediate sense of kind of what you're describing, and particularly the overwhelmingly white communities in which it sometimes is happening. And you know, I can't resist, given that this is November 5th and we still don't know what's going on with the White House, you know, asking you how your findings and how your interpretations of your findings have affected your view of Trumpism, and particularly Trumpism's deep embeddedness and dependence on white rural voters, and whether you see opportunities or the opposite, right? Whether you see you know, only problems based on what you've learned in your own research. I'm sorry if that's a vague question, but basically, what do you think? What do you think about this election and Trump?
Well, this is all very complicated. So rural communities have been getting a lot of the blame for this, and America is a white supremacist racial project. It's not rural America, right? It's America, and actually some of them. So there are things. I live in Wisconsin, right? I've lived in North Carolina, Arizona, Texas, Illinois. Am I missing anywhere? I've been moving everywhere. But so we think that the South and rural places are the most racist places in the country, right? And you know, I moved my family to Forest City, which if I had a pseudonym for that town, it would just be Racist Town, right? That's why I just chose to use the actual town's name in my book. This isn't about, I don't think Trumpism is in rural America. I think though it's in ex-urban and suburban America. I'll have to give you more personal stuff. I think New Yorkers, and this is the whole state, northern places that are more urban centered. I know that folks, I know you think New York is the center of the world, but from my perspective, you weren't even top 5 prison building. Neither was California. California nor New York. Oklahoma built more prisons than California or New York, okay? So from my perspective, you aren't that big a deal. I live in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is the most racist state in the country. Okay, it's the disproportionate rate of incarceration for African Americans is 4 times what it is in Texas. All right. So there's this belief that it's rural America or it's the South, but it's not even the rural places in Wisconsin. It's the most belligerent folks are in the suburbs of Milwaukee. And what we saw with the Jacob Blake shooting, they're in the small cities, right? Kenosha is not a rural community. I know everything outside of the 5 boroughs seems like it's just a pissant town to you guys, but Kenosha is a small city. It is not a rural community. That's where we are in America. And from my perspective, I lived in a place called College Station, Texas. Only people who run Stata, which is a statistical program, may have even heard of this. It's a home of Stata and Texas A&M University. That place is, I don't know if livestock are fit to live there. But I know that humans, not whether you're black, gay, lesbian, whatever, definitely, I don't think people should live there or in places like that. They voted over, I'm guessing over 90% for Trump. That place is not considered rural, right? It's exurban. Those are the places that are problematic. And that's the issue. I think everybody's waking up late. Like, I think there's still a hangover from how did he ever get elected? Well, I've lived in Arizona, Maricopa County with Sheriff Joe, right? Under his reign. I lived in North Carolina. I saw what was going on the ground on North Carolina. I did 4 years in College Station before I moved to Houston because my kid who has he almost got a perfect SAT score and was a multi-sport athlete, got kicked out of school for having dreadlocks, right? We ended up suing the school district. This is how crazy America is. And that wasn't rural America. Where we are politically I think there's some hard conversations that need to be had. And I think there are people who have not been, there's the recent woke, and people are reading these books now. They're in book clubs and they're crying about stuff. Oh my God, I'm racist. And people are new to the fact that racism exists. And if you've been a person of color in America, especially if you're Black, anti-Blackness has been something that's part of our everyday experience. And this isn't about individuals, this is about how it's replicated across culture. So the white supremacist racial violence that we are basically laying, and that's what we saw in Kenosha. I have another op-ed in Wait at the Conversation that's coming out. We're talking about the fact that there may be many more Kenoshas, right? So your question is, it deals with the political economy of place. You have more Trump voters living in racially diverse neighborhoods and in towns like Kenosha. We're just going to see a lot more of this stuff. This is not Trump's America. We produce Trump. Trump didn't make this into America. We produced him. And we've sowed these seeds long ago. And we just keep watering them. So I'm sorry, I'd like to have more of a, I wish we would have reclaimed the House and Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have held on, but this is where we've been for a while. And I've been looking at it, I guess, from the bottom view because I study punishment. If we can do what we've been doing, Obama wasn't good. Biden wasn't good for immigrant detention. Think about that, how terrible that was. So if they weren't good for immigrant detention, if they were rather terrible, in fact, because I have a project looking at their era, what we're seeing with Trump is just, it's unbridled. It's an unbridled culture and expression. It's very problematic. But this has been there. This has been there.
Thank you.
I'd like to have a more positive. I think we can actually, whoever's president is not going to matter for what I'm talking about with prison building. If you want to reduce mass incarceration, you don't just vote. Whoever's president, we have to protest and work on our local officials to reduce the number. COVID is a great excuse. You have a jail and they haven't decarcerated, you should be all on top of your local sheriff to decarcerate. And you can point towards Dane County. I can show you the number. I have a whole presentation on that. We've stopped hundreds of cases of COVID. Hundreds of cases. We've documented this, right? How we could have had a major outbreak if they didn't decarcerate from the jail. That's what I'll end on, more of a positive note. The political stuff, it's like, how are we going to fix racism? Got no answer for you there.
Can't solve that for us.
Daria keeps shaking her head. One of you.
Professor Eason, you invoked New York earlier, and we actually have a question about how your research relates to New York State. So let me give William Martin a chance to jump in.
Yeah,
Oh,
I probably should say I've known John for a while, and I've been a student of his work for a while. And if you know the literature coming out of the Chicago School or the Harvard School, William Julius Wilson or Rob Sampson or other, you can see how it runs against the grain, because they talk about disadvantage and the eruption of mass incarceration by Reagan and Republicans. And as John pointed out in the slides, it's more often in Democratic areas and not in white states, but massively in the South. But let's be serious. We're sitting here in New York, as we would through most of the Northeast and in the Midwest. And, mass incarceration has been a phenomenon of largely white communities who built the prisons, not his Black Southern communities. So in some ways, how different is that? And, this relates to the questions on Trump. These are the areas that, have voted for Trump, not his Southern Black states that have built all these prisons. The majority is, his data shows, right? So we've got a bit of a problem. We look at rural New York, and I don't know if people in Buffalo consider themselves as being rural. But certainly I'm down here in Binghamton. No, you don't. You don't even consider yourself upstate. Oh, you chauvinists in Buffalo, as bad as the New York City people. But the reality is, I live in the incarceration capital of New York State. The incarceration rate in Broome County in Binghamton is higher than in the Bronx or Brooklyn or anywhere in the state, right? So when we talk about mass incarceration, although the racial inequities and ratios are much higher here than, the inequalities than in other areas of the state, 80% of the people in the jail are white. So I guess my question to John is, how is, mass incarceration and decarceration, if he wants to talk about it, so very different in these rural white communities? At least he points us at the rural areas and the smaller towns and white communities, right? But the book itself doesn't tell us an answer to that question. And as we look at the Trump phenomenon, I'm confronted locally by a really high incarceration of poor whites. Our poverty rate in Broome County is higher than in the Bronx or Brooklyn, right? We're ranked 56th on health measures. But what tools does that kind of research on the South give us to understand what's going on in, Ohio, Indiana, and indeed some of the Western states? And we could talk about Texas, but it's a Latinx question. So,
yeah.
How do the northern rural areas, which are the Trump question, but also the centers of mass incarceration? We built our prisons not in New York City or in the Hudson Valley in the 90s, but, in Malone, in Chateauguay, and in the north. And incarceration capitals now are places in rural areas, not New York City. So it's a really different situation than what most students of mass incarceration talk about. How different is it,
Well,
Mr. Eason?
it's
Sorry,
very
Professor Eason.
different.
I've just white explained you.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. I don't know if you guys saw, I put up Bill's book, After Prison. So that's the book I was ending on.
Doesn't mean I can't give you trouble.
No, I know. This is expected. Shouldn't invite people who know you. This is what happens when people show up. So I don't think that we've come to terms with the fact that we have an incarceration problem in the US. We think that it's other people, just like we think a drug problem is other people. And when I say we, I'm talking about middle America, white America. We don't, even if you have, everyone has somebody in prison. More than half of the US, 60%, has a family member or knows someone in prison, right? That's a recent study, right? So if we're in rural communities where you have all of this disadvantage, like in Broome County, you're going to have more white people going to prison. I had a slide up earlier where I was showing Arkansas, and it looked fairly even between Blacks and whites across the state. There are actually more white women who have cycled in and out of the Arkansas Department of Corrections than Black women. So yes, this is a huge issue. We're going to have to change how we think about who we're locking up and why. So even this stuff around, we're going to be kinder and medicalize meth, that hasn't exactly slowed down incarceration, right? It probably tamped it down some, but we have underlying issues that we need to address. So if you want to call it the Green New Deal, I think this is a crowd that may be more amenable to that. If you want to call it the Green New Deal, I don't care what you call it. We need some form of development that targets rural communities, right? We need massive infrastructure investments because that's what prison building was. It was a public works campaign. We built all of these prisons because there was very little infrastructure and very few economic opportunities. And what I didn't show you guys was that towns that get prisons versus those that don't, this is wildly unpopular. It took me 7 years to publish this paper. Those towns see return on investment in 4 major ways. They get a higher median home value. They have higher median family income. They have less poverty and less unemployment. So that's a huge incentive for places not to give up prisons, right? But the question isn't whether or not we give these places prisons, is what else are we giving them? What else can be brought into these communities? And so we have an issue with density now. So is New York ever going to be New York again? No matter how, I know we have folks that really believe in the city and the life of the city, but are we going to be remote? Are certain people just walking away from the density of cities? And if so, how can rural areas make themselves attractive, right? So that means we need infrastructure there that would support. We don't have broadband in a lot of rural communities, right? Most of the developed world has broadband free. We don't even have broadband. There were places in rural Louisiana that got their first phone service in 2007, right? There's so many rural communities that don't have broadband. So if we want to take the digital economy to rural communities, we need to build up broadband access. We need a whole host of new infrastructure investments in those communities to make them more viable. We could have escaped the cities a little easier and reduced density in places like New York if we had better like Wi-Fi and other economic development in rural communities. But we've underdeveloped and purposely not underdeveloped these communities so much so that they don't have basic services, right? And roads, they don't have, forget about like stoplights, they don't have roads, literally. There are places in this country that have dirt roads still. So when you think about that, and that lack of investment, that lack of development, that's, forget about deindustrialization. Some places were never industrialized, right? So when you look at it that way, you begin to understand why white people in those communities, you either go to the service, you either go into the armed forces, or you end up on drugs, selling drugs, and or in prison because there are so few economic opportunities in those communities. And unless we rebuild or actually build in those communities, we're going to see a continuation of rural people and white people going to prison more and more. Maybe now Derek Bell, I'm forgetting the exact, someone would have to, we have enough legal scholars in the room that study race, but basically the old adage about how Black folks can't get anything until white folks get it, or until it's bad enough for white folks to be affected by it. I'm forgetting the exact, it's been 5 or 6 years. I'm old enough to forget stuff now. This is funny. This term by Derek Bell, the legal scholar. But yeah, this is exactly what he was writing about, right? Anybody gonna throw me a bone on that? Do we have it in the chat or anything? No.
I haven't gotten the answer, and I confess I don't have it. I think you're allowed to forget, though.
Yeah, okay. But you all get what I'm saying. We're at a point where it's like, white people are going to prison now. The disproportionate rate of incarceration is actually between Black men and white men. Since the late 90s, it's actually decreased a little. Since like slavery times, since convict leasing, right? That's how many white people we're sending to prison. And there's a lot from rural communities. So unless we start to invest in different ways, we're gonna see these trends continue.
So Professor Eason, we have a question next from Moody Ojeme.
Hi, Professor Eason. Thank you very much for this very rich presentation. I have a question. For law enforcement agents who might be out of job, there is massive decarceration across the country. What alternatives would you suggest for people in that group?
Well, first of all, I think it's going to vary widely, right? Who gets pushed out. But once again, that's a public sector job and there's strong unions. So I don't see the size of the police force. If we shrank even if we shrink our level of decarceration, that's front end. So we'll have to change how we police. I don't see us putting a whole bunch of police officers out of work without retraining them, right? I mean, we think about it this way. There's been the political will to do it is going to be like insurmountable anyway. I'm really worried about even the talk to do that. We don't want to do a single payer system for healthcare because we don't want the insured. Who cares? I'm sorry if you work for insurance, but who cares about insurance companies, right? That's why we don't want to do single payer, because we'd be unemployed. We'd have to fire all the insurance agents, right? And they make up hundreds of thousands of workers. So that's one of the main reasons we don't want to do single payer, because it would affect that industry. Cops are not as highly trained and educated on average. They need to go through retraining and education anyway for whatever career they need to go into after they're going to be a police officer. Because at a certain age, you know, I think most police departments let you retire at 20, after 20 years. If you're 50, let's say you start late, you start at 30 as a police officer. If you're 50, do you think you really want to chase somebody over a purse? You think like if there are any cops, and we could talk about the actual job of policing and the physical. I'm not even going to get on the whole donut thing, and really, because there are a lot of cops who actually take care of themselves and are in shape, but just there are professors who are like, I can't take the physical work of walking into a class anymore. These 20-year-olds are driving me crazy. You want to deal with crazy 20-year-olds that you have to arrest, because that's most of the population getting arrested. Police officers don't necessarily, all of them don't necessarily want to be cops their whole life anyway. We have to start giving alternative career paths. This seemed like what's attractive about policing is it's public sector, you have good health benefits, right? And it's a stable pay. There are other ways we can do that. There aren't everybody that's a police officer. A lot of them actually wanted to do social work or some other form of helping people. This isn't always, the other forms of social work don't pay. Maybe we need to start paying social workers. Maybe we'd have some cops migrate from there, and we can have we can lower the number of police officers that way. But if you try and take it head on, you should look up FOP, Fraternal Order of Police, and also look behind the NRA. That's who's backing the NRA. The nearly 1 million police officers we have. It's a very political thing. So they don't even care about the defund the police stuff, right? And all they hear is you're trying to take my job. There's a whole other way of thinking about this. So that's what I would focus on. increasing resources around health and human safety.
Professor Eason, I wonder if I can build on that last question and ask you to conclude with some thoughts, because you alluded to this in your talk about how do we reduce dependence on rural prison building and proliferation? How might we mitigate against that?
Green New Deal, infrastructure that includes infrastructure and focus on, you have land, right? You have land in rural communities. You have people who have, if there's any, you have population loss, but the people who have decided to stay there love those places. And if you work with them to create local solutions, you don't have to call it the Green New Deal, but you can have some type of emphasis on modernizing their infrastructure, updating their infrastructure with an eye towards it being more eco-friendly, and capturing the spirit of that local community and reflecting whatever agenda you're going to put forward. So really having a mind to work with those communities. I think that's how, and really we have to do something about healthcare. I don't even want to go into like UBI or something like, if we don't have a baseline of what we're supposed, we think we're the world leader, right? Other countries think we're crazy because we stand in line to vote. They don't even stand in line to vote. If we're going to really be a world leader, we have to get rid of all of the inefficiencies. If you want to use a market straight economic approach, we can, whatever approach you want to use, however you need to sell it, depending on what community, we really have to invest in people and these places that have been underdeveloped. That's how you get them to move away from their over-reliance on all forms of punishment. And you can get new people to move into those communities. So I, despite all of the bad news I've delivered, I am actually hopeful. 5 years ago, I was like, we just can walk away from this. We built 1,600 plus prisons. And it's, basically the size of Rhode Island, right? If you put them all together. I was really, when I did a little graphic around that, I got pretty hopeless. But I think if we want to, we can chip away at this as a local problem. We can start working together at the state level. So Professor Martin pointed out what's going on in Broome County. I doubt many people know what's going on there. Or the fact that the sheriff there is the opposite of the sheriff in Dane County. He hasn't let anybody out during COVID. And these are white people. 80% of his people are white, right? And he's like, oh, you can get COVID. I don't care. They're not testing there. Just having basic empathy, right? In every form. And considering rural communities. And actually, for everybody on the call, stop thinking New York is the center of the world. It's not. U.S. is a
not
big
New York,
place.
just Buffalo.
Okay, that's fine. I'd rather Buffalo than New York City.
No, really,
I'm
truly,
done.
thank you so much for that, Professor.
I'm done with New York City. Just, I'll leave on that with that parting shot. I'm a hater of New York City today. So thank you guys for having me.
If everyone can join me in thanking Professor Eason, really, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And we
Y'all have a good evening. Thanks again.
Thank you all.